The physical therapy appointment card sat on my kitchen table like evidence of my own foolishness. Tuesday, 3:30 p.m. It read in neat blue ink. Today. The same appointment I'd mentioned to my son Daniel 3 times this week, each conversation ending with his distracted nod and mumbled, "Sure, Mom." I glanced at the clock. 2:45 p.m. My knee throbbed with that deep, persistent ache that had become my constant companion since the surgery 6 weeks ago. The doctor had been clear. Missing these sessions would set back my recovery significantly. At 73, setbacks weren't luxuries I could afford. I picked up my phone and called Daniel again. "Yeah?" His voice carried that edge of irritation that had crept into our conversations lately, the tone people use when they're perpetually inconvenienced by your existence. "Daniel, honey, I'm sorry to bother you, but my appointment is in 40 minutes. I know you said—" "Mom, I can't. I told you yesterday." "Had he? I didn't remember. Look, call an Uber or something." An Uber. As if my fixed income stretched to cover $20 rides to medical appointments. As if asking my only son for help was unreasonable rather than natural. As if 32 years of raising him, of driving him to soccer practice and piano lessons and friends' houses, meant nothing when roles reversed. "Daniel, you know I don't understand those apps. Could you maybe—" "Figure it out, Mom. I'm busy." On the line went dead. I sat there holding the silent phone, staring at the appointment card that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the good it would do me now. The silence in my house felt different somehow, not the comfortable quiet of a well-lived life, but the hollow echo of abandonment. This wasn't the first time. 2 weeks ago, when I'd needed groceries and couldn't manage the walking required for a full shopping trip, Daniel had sighed heavily and suggested I order delivery. When I'd asked him to help me change a light bulb in the ceiling fixture I couldn't safely reach, he'd recommended I call a handyman. When I'd mentioned feeling isolated during the long days of recovery, he'd suggested I join some senior activities. Each suggestion came wrapped in the implication that my needs were problems to be solved rather than opportunities for connection, that my age and temporary disability made me burdensome rather than deserving of the same care I'd provided him without question throughout his childhood and difficult teenage years. I remembered those years so clearly now, sitting in my empty kitchen with my swollen knee propped on a chair. The late nights when he'd had nightmares, and I'd sat beside his bed until dawn, stroking his hair and singing old lullabies in my off-key voice. The expensive orthodontist appointments I'd worked double shifts to afford, because his smile mattered more than my exhaustion. The college tuition I'd paid by refinancing this very house, using up my retirement savings because his education felt more important than my security. Had I raised him to be cruel? Or had I somehow failed to teach him that love flows both ways, that families support each other through all seasons of need? The woman who'd driven countless miles to his baseball games now couldn't get a ride to physical therapy. The mother who'd attended every school play and parent conference now received rushed phone calls and suggestions to figure it out. The person who'd sacrificed her own dreams to fund his education now found herself dismissed as an inconvenience. I limped to the window and watched Mrs. Patterson across the street tend her garden, moving slowly but steadily among her roses. She was 86 and still drove herself everywhere, still maintained her independence with the fierce dignity of someone who'd never learned to depend on ungrateful children. I envied her that self-reliance, even as I mourned my own lost confidence. If you like emotional stories like this one, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here. And tell me, from which city are you watching? I think there are many of you who understand exactly how this kind of quiet hurt feels, how love can become invisible to the very people who benefit from it most. The afternoon stretched ahead of me like a judgment. I could call the doctor's office and cancel, admitting that my recovery mattered less than my son's convenience. I could sit here feeling sorry for myself, nursing both my physical pain and my wounded heart until they became indistinguishable. Or I could do what I'd done my entire life when faced with impossible situations, find another way. I picked up my phone again, this time scrolling through contacts I hadn't called in months. Margaret from church, whose arthritis was worse than mine but who still volunteered at the food bank. Elena from the book club I'd stopped attending after my surgery, citing pain, but really avoiding the pity I imagined in their eyes. Sarah from next door, who'd brought soup during my first week home, and whom I'd been too proud to burden with additional requests. My finger hovered over Margaret's number. Pride whispered that I shouldn't have to ask strangers for help that my own family refused to provide. Dignity suggested that admitting my situation would expose the failure of my most important relationship, but survival demanded I swallow both pride and dignity in favor of the practical recognition that healing required community, even when family failed. "Margaret, it's Teresa. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." The words felt foreign on my tongue. This request for help from someone who'd known me as capable and independent for 20 years. But Margaret's warm voice, her immediate offer to drive me, her gentle dismissal of my apologies as unnecessary, these responses reminded me that not all relationships were transactions. Some people still understood that helping others was privilege rather than burden. That community meant showing up for each other without keeping careful score of who owed what to whom. As I gathered my purse and appointment paperwork, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me appeared older than 73, worn down by more than just physical pain. But beneath the disappointment and hurt, I glimpsed something else. A spark of the person I'd been before I'd learned to minimize my needs and maximize my gratitude for the smallest kindnesses from my own child. Margaret's gentle knock at the door interrupted my reflection. Time to go face whatever came next, one step at a time. Margaret's kindness felt like a lifeline that afternoon, but it also highlighted how far Daniel and I had drifted. As she helped me navigate the physical therapy exercises, chatting easily about her grandchildren's latest adventures, I couldn't help but contrast her warmth with my son's growing coldness. The pattern had been building for months, though I'd been too hopeful to acknowledge it fully. Phone calls that used to last 20 minutes now ended after 5. His visits, once weekly Sunday dinners filled with conversation and laughter, had dwindled to brief, obligatory stops where he checked his phone more than he looked at me. "How's Daniel doing?" Margaret asked on the drive home, her question innocent, but somehow piercing. "Oh, you know how busy young people are these days," I replied automatically, the same deflection I'd been using with friends and neighbors for weeks. The truth felt too shameful to voice, that my successful, well-educated son seemed to view me as an inconvenience rather than family. That evening, I decided to try something different. Instead of waiting for Daniel to call or visit, I prepared his favorite meal, the pot roast with carrots and potatoes he'd loved since childhood, complete with the chocolate cake that had been his birthday request every year until he turned 25 and decided such traditions were too much trouble. I set the table for 2, using the good china we'd saved for holidays, the same plates where we'd shared countless meals during his teenage years, where he'd told me about his first heartbreak and his college acceptance letters, where we'd planned his future with the easy confidence of people who assumed love was permanent. When he arrived at 6:30, his expression shifted from surprise to something that looked uncomfortably like irritation. "Mom, you didn't need to go to all this trouble," he said. But the way he said trouble made it clear he viewed my effort as exactly that, an unwelcome obligation rather than a gift. "It's no trouble at all," I lied, ignoring the way my knee had protested every moment of standing required to prepare this meal. "I thought it would be nice to have a proper dinner together. We haven't done that in so long." Daniel sat down with the air of someone fulfilling an unpleasant duty. His phone remained on the table beside his plate. Screen up, notifications lighting it periodically throughout our meal. Each buzz seemed to pull his attention further away from our conversation, what little there was of it. I asked about his work, his girlfriend Melissa, his plans for the upcoming holiday. His answers were perfunctory, delivered between glances at his phone. When I mentioned that Mrs. Patterson's daughter visited twice a week to help with grocery shopping and household tasks, he looked up sharply. "Are you trying to make some kind of point, Mom?" The question stung because yes, I suppose I was, but hearing it said so directly with such defensive irritation made me feel small and manipulative rather than simply hopeful. "No, honey, I was just making conversation. Because if you need help with something specific, you can just ask instead of dropping hints." His tone carried the exasperated patience adults use with difficult children, and I felt something shrivel inside my chest. "I'm not dropping hints. I'm just lonely sometimes." The admission hung between us like an unwelcome guest. Daniel's expression softened slightly, but not in the way I'd hoped. Instead, he looked at me with the uncomfortable pity people reserve for situations they can't fix and don't want to engage with deeply. Maybe you should think about joining some activities, he said gently, as if this suggestion hadn't occurred to me a dozen times already. Senior centers have lots of programs. You might meet people. As if what I needed was strangers rather than connection with my own son. As if the solution to missing him was to replace him with generic social contact that required nothing from him and offered him nothing in return. We finished dinner in relative silence. Daniel helped clear the table with the efficient movements of someone completing a task rather than sharing an intimate family moment. When he kissed my forehead goodbye, it felt ceremonial rather than affectionate. "Thanks for dinner, Mom. It was really good." The words were correct, but they carried all the warmth of a thank you note to a distant relative. After he left, I sat surrounded by dishes that had once symbolized celebration, but now felt like evidence of my own desperate need for connection. The chocolate cake sat mostly untouched. Daniel had taken a small piece out of politeness, but claimed he was watching his diet and couldn't finish it. I wrapped the leftovers in containers that would last me most of the week, wondering when cooking for family had become an exercise in hope rather than joy. The pot roast that had once been his favorite now seemed like a failed attempt to recreate intimacy that no longer existed naturally between us. The phone rang as I was finishing the dishes. Melissa, Daniel's girlfriend of 2 years. Her voice carried the bright artificiality of someone making an effort to be kind to an elderly person she didn't particularly understand or connect with. "Hi, Mrs. Morrison. Daniel told me about the lovely dinner you made tonight. I just wanted to say thank you for including him in your evening." Including him? As if inviting my own son to dinner was a favor I was doing him rather than a natural expression of love and desire for companionship. "Of course, dear. You're always welcome too, you know." "Oh, that's so sweet of you to say. We're just so busy these days with work and the gym and our social commitments. But maybe sometime soon." The promise felt hollow, delivered with the cheerful insincerity of someone who had no intention of following through, but wanted to maintain the appearance of familial consideration. After we hung up, I understood something that made my chest feel tight and airless. I had become the kind of person others accommodated rather than included, tolerated rather than treasured. My needs were problems to be managed rather than opportunities for connection. My love had become burdensome rather than welcome. The realization settled over me like a heavy blanket, warm but suffocating. I was no longer Daniel's mother in any meaningful sense. I was an elderly woman who happened to have raised him, someone whose continuing presence in his life required maintenance rather than brought joy. That night, I lay in my empty house listening to the familiar sounds of settling wood and distant traffic, wondering when I had become so easy to dismiss. When had my son learned to see my attempts at connection as manipulation rather than love? When had my desire for his company become something he endured rather than enjoyed? Outside my bedroom window, I could see lights in other houses where families presumably gathered without the careful negotiation that now characterized my relationship with Daniel. Where adult children called their parents for advice rather than avoiding their calls. Where Sunday dinners happened because people wanted to be together, not because guilt or obligation demanded their presence. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time Daniel had seemed genuinely happy to see me. The last time our conversation had flowed naturally, rather than feeling forced and stilted. The memory was there, but it felt ancient, separated from the present by months of accumulating distance that I'd been too hopeful to acknowledge as permanent change rather than temporary adjustment. The following Tuesday, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of asking Daniel for help, I would offer mine. Surely he couldn't be irritated by a mother wanting to be useful, to contribute something positive to his increasingly busy life. I spent the morning researching his current project at the engineering firm, something about sustainable building materials that I only half understood but found genuinely interesting. When I called him at lunch, I had carefully prepared talking points about recent articles I'd found online that might relate to his work. "Daniel, honey, I was reading about these new bamboo composites that—" "Mom, I'm in the middle of something. Can this wait?" "Of course, but I thought you might find it interesting for your project. The article mentioned—" "I really can't talk right now. I'll call you back." He didn't call back. I knew he wouldn't, but I waited anyway, keeping my phone close through dinner and the evening news, hoping for the sound that never came. The next week, I tried again. This time, I offered to help with household tasks. Melissa had mentioned in passing that they never had time for proper cleaning with their demanding schedules. I could manage light housework, I reasoned. My knee was improving, and I had nothing but time. "You want to clean my apartment?" Daniel's voice carried a note of bewilderment, as if I'd suggested something completely absurd. "Not clean exactly. Just help with organization, maybe some laundry. I remember how overwhelming it can be when you're working such long hours." "Mom, we have a cleaning service." Of course they did. People with good jobs and no dependents could afford such luxuries. I felt foolish for not realizing this, for assuming that my help might be wanted or needed in a life that had already solved its domestic challenges with money rather than family support. "Oh, well, maybe I could cook some meals for your freezer. You know how you used to love when I made those casseroles you could heat up during finals week." The pause stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice carried a carefully controlled patience that was somehow worse than outright irritation. "That's really not necessary, Mom. We meal prep on Sundays. We have a system that works for us. A system that didn't include me. A life organized around efficiency and independence that left no space for the kind of generational support that had once felt natural and reciprocal. I was offering solutions to problems that had already been solved without me, inserting myself into routines that functioned better in my absence. When Daniel's birthday approached in October, I saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate that my love still had value, even if my practical help had been rendered obsolete by their affluent lifestyle. I spent weeks planning something special, not the elaborate celebrations of his childhood, which would seem excessive now, but a meaningful gesture that acknowledged who he'd become while honoring who we'd been together. I decided to frame some of our favorite family photos, creating a collection that told the story of his childhood and young adulthood. Pictures from his high school graduation, his first day of college, the Christmas morning when he'd opened his acceptance letter to engineering school, memories of times when he'd seemed proud to be my son, when our relationship had been characterized by joy rather than obligation. I spent an entire afternoon at the frame shop, choosing mats and glass that would protect these precious images for decades to come. The cost was more than I usually spent on groceries for a month, but some things mattered more than financial prudence. Love, I reasoned, was worth the investment. When I called to arrange giving him the gift, Daniel sounded genuinely surprised. "Mom, you really didn't need to get me anything. I told you we're trying to minimize possessions. We don't have space for a lot of stuff." Stuff. He'd reduced my carefully chosen gift to stuff before he'd even seen it. But I persisted, certain that once he saw the thoughtfulness behind the gesture, he'd understand the love it represented. We met at a coffee shop near his office, a neutral location he'd suggested when I offered to drive to his apartment. The frames sat in a carefully wrapped package beside my chair, and I felt genuinely excited for the first time in months. This was going to rebuild something between us. This was going to remind him of our connection. Daniel arrived 15 minutes late, still checking his phone as he sat down across from me. He ordered a coffee to go rather than sitting down to share the kind of leisurely conversation the wrapped gift beside my chair seemed to invite. "Sorry, I can only stay a few minutes. Melissa and I are meeting her parents for dinner." Melissa's parents. When was the last time he'd made time for dinner with me that wasn't prefaced with apologies about how briefly he could stay? I handed him the package with hands that trembled slightly from anticipation. "I hope you like it. I thought you might want to have some family pictures in your new place." He unwrapped the frames with the polite attention of someone opening a gift they didn't particularly want, but felt obligated to acknowledge. As each photo was revealed, his expression grew more uncomfortable rather than more pleased. "These are really nice, Mom. Thank you." The words were correct, but his tone suggested he was thanking me for something he'd specifically requested not to receive. "I'm just not sure where we'll put them. Our aesthetic is pretty minimalist." Aesthetic. As if the visual evidence of his childhood didn't fit the sophisticated image he and Melissa were cultivating in their carefully curated living space. As if 23 years of family history was clutter rather than treasure. "You could just pick one or two favorites," I suggested, feeling desperate to salvage something from this interaction. "Maybe the graduation picture? You looked so handsome in your cap and gown." Daniel glanced at his watch. An expensive piece I'd never seen before, probably a gift from Melissa or her parents who could afford such gestures without sacrificing grocery money. "I really do need to go," he said, gathering the frames and wrapping them hastily in their tissue paper. "But thank you. This was really thoughtful." He kissed my cheek with the same ceremonial distance that had characterized our relationship for months. leaving me sitting alone at a coffee shop with the growing realization that my thoughtfulness had become an embarrassment to him rather than a gift. That evening, Melissa posted photos on social media from their dinner with her parents, an elegant restaurant I'd never heard of, wine that probably cost more than my weekly budget, everyone dressed in the kind of casual sophistication that required significant financial resources to achieve. Her parents looked proud and comfortable, people who clearly felt welcome in their daughter's upgraded life rather than tolerated as reminders of a less polished past. I stared at those photos for a long time, wondering when I had become the kind of mother whose love felt intrusive rather than precious, whose gifts represented problems rather than gestures of affection. When had my son learned to be ashamed of sentiment, of the visual evidence that he'd once been someone's beloved child, rather than a self-made man with no need for maternal connection? The frames I'd so carefully chosen sat somewhere in Daniel's minimalist apartment, probably stored in a closet where they wouldn't disrupt the aesthetic he and Melissa had worked so hard to create, out of sight, like the relationship that had created them. The weeks following Daniel's birthday settled into a pattern of careful distance that I began to recognize as my new normal. I stopped calling him during his lunch breaks, stopped suggesting dinners, stopped looking for articles that might interest him. The silence felt safer than the repeated experience of having my attempts at connection treated as interruptions. My physical therapy sessions became the highlight of my week, not just for the progress with my knee, but for the company of other people recovering from their own setbacks. There was something comforting about being surrounded by others whose bodies had betrayed them temporarily, whose healing required patience and community support. Margaret continued driving me twice a week, and our conversations gradually shifted from polite exchanges about the weather to more honest discussions about the challenges of aging in a world that seemed increasingly impatient with anything that required extra time or consideration. "My daughter thinks I should move to one of those senior communities," Margaret mentioned one afternoon as we sat in the waiting room. "She says it would be better for me to be around people my own age instead of rattling around in a house that's too big for one person." I nodded, understanding the subtext. Children who loved you wanted you safely contained where your needs could be managed by professionals rather than disrupting their carefully organized lives. Love expressed through delegation rather than presence. "What do you think about that?" I asked, genuinely curious about how someone else navigated the delicate balance between independence and acknowledging limitations. "I think she means well," Margaret said carefully. "But I also think she's relieved by the idea of not having to worry about me falling down the stairs or forgetting to turn off the stove. It would make her life easier, which she probably thinks would make mine better too." We sat in comfortable silence, both understanding the painful mathematics of adult children who calculated love in terms of convenience rather than connection, who solved problems by removing them rather than engaging with them. At home, I found myself avoiding the rituals that had once brought me joy, but now highlighted my isolation. The dining room table stayed set for one. I stopped cooking elaborate meals, settling instead for simple foods that required minimal preparation, and created no leftovers that would remind me of my solitary state. The house itself seemed to echo differently now, not just with physical emptiness, but with the absence of expectation. I no longer listened for Daniel's car in the driveway, or kept my phone close in case he called. The disappointment of hope deferred had been replaced by the dull ache of hope abandoned. One evening in November, as I sat in my living room reading a book I wasn't particularly enjoying, the phone rang. For a moment, my heart lifted with the old anticipation. Maybe Daniel had realized how distant we'd become. Maybe he wanted to bridge the gap that had opened between us. But it was Melissa, her voice carrying that same bright artificiality that had become familiar over the past year. "Hi, Mrs. Morrison. I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to invite you to Thanksgiving dinner at our apartment." The invitation should have felt like a gift, but something in Melissa's tone suggested it was more obligation than desire. Still, it was an opportunity to see Daniel in a social setting, where perhaps the constraints of family intimacy wouldn't weigh so heavily on him. "That's very thoughtful of you, dear. I'd love to come." "Wonderful. It'll be a small group, just us and my parents, and my sister and her husband. Very casual, nothing fancy." Melissa's family. A Thanksgiving dinner where I would be the guest rather than the host, the outsider rather than the center of family tradition, where Daniel would be surrounded by people who didn't carry the weight of having raised him. whose relationships with him were uncomplicated by history or expectation. "Should I bring anything?" I asked, falling back on the social protocols that helped navigate uncomfortable situations. "Oh, no need. We have everything covered. Just bring yourself." Just myself. As if that were enough. As if my presence alone constituted a meaningful contribution to a celebration organized around gratitude for family connections. After we hung up, I sat with the strange mixture of gratitude and dread that the invitation had created. Thanksgiving had always been my holiday, the day when Daniel would arrive early to help with preparations, when we'd cook together and share stories while the turkey roasted, when he'd insist on taking leftovers home because no one makes stuffing like Mom. Now I would be a guest at someone else's table, watching Melissa's mother coordinate the meal while I sat politely aside, useful for nothing except filling an empty chair and providing Daniel with evidence that he'd fulfilled his filial obligations. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving passed quietly. My physical therapy sessions were going well, my knee was stronger, my mobility improving daily, but the emotional healing I'd hoped would accompany physical recovery seemed more elusive. Strength was returning to my body while my spirit felt increasingly fragile. I found myself spending long hours looking through photo albums, not with the sentimentality of someone celebrating happy memories, but with the archaeological curiosity of someone trying to understand when things had changed. When had Daniel's smile become forced in family pictures? When had his posture shifted from relaxed belonging to polite tolerance? There was a photo from his college graduation that I studied particularly closely. Daniel stood between his father and me, his arms around both our shoulders, his grin genuine and unguarded. His father had been gone for 5 years now, a heart attack that had left Daniel and me as each other's closest family. In that graduation photo, we looked like people who enjoyed each other's company, who found comfort in shared celebration. What had happened to that easy affection? When had I become someone he tolerated rather than treasured? The answer, I was beginning to understand, lay not in any single moment of change, but in the gradual accumulation of his success and my increasing inability to contribute meaningfully to his upgraded life. I had become a reminder of simpler times when he'd needed me, when my love had solved problems and provided comfort that money and professional achievement couldn't purchase. Now, my love was inconvenient rather than essential, nostalgic rather than practical. I represented a version of himself he'd outgrown, a past that didn't align with the sophisticated future he was building with Melissa. 3 days before Thanksgiving, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Melissa and politely declined the dinner invitation, claiming that my knee wasn't quite ready for extended social events. It was partially true. Sitting in uncomfortable chairs for hours would indeed be challenging. But the real reason was simpler. I was tired of being tolerated rather than wanted, tired of performing gratitude for inclusion that felt more like charity than love. "Oh no!" Melissa's voice carried genuine disappointment, which was somehow more painful than indifference would have been. "Daniel will be so sorry you can't make it." Would he be? I doubted it, though I appreciated Melissa's kindness in suggesting otherwise. Daniel would probably feel relieved not to have to navigate the careful management of his mother's feelings while trying to impress his girlfriend's family with his maturity and independence. That Thanksgiving, I accepted Margaret's invitation to join a potluck dinner at the church, where a dozen other people without traditional family gatherings shared a meal that felt more genuinely grateful than obligatory. No one asked probing questions about my family or expressed pity for my circumstances. We simply shared food and conversation and the quiet comfort of community, chosen rather than imposed. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. A secret that would change everything Daniel thought he understood about independence and family obligations. Something I'd been saving for the right moment, though I was beginning to realize that moment might never come naturally. Sometimes the people we love most need to learn lessons they resist learning. And sometimes love requires difficult choices that feel like betrayal, but serve deeper truths about respect and reciprocity. December arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything seem sharper, more defined. As I sat in my kitchen that first morning of the month, watching frost patterns form on my windows, I felt something shifting inside me that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. The realization came quietly, without drama or revelation, the way important truths often do. I'd spent months trying to accommodate myself to Daniel's version of our relationship, the polite distance, the careful management of my expectations, the gradual reduction of my role from mother to occasional inconvenience. But somewhere in the process of accepting his limitations, I'd forgotten my own worth. I pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years, one stored in the back of my bedroom closet behind winter coats and forgotten Christmas decorations. Inside were documents and photographs that told a different story about Teresa Morrison than the one I'd been living lately. Evidence of a woman who'd once been capable of remarkable things, who'd built something significant before she'd learned to make herself smaller to fit other people's comfort levels. The first item I touched was my college diploma, earned when Daniel was in middle school, and most women my age had already accepted that their learning years were behind them. I'd attended night classes for 4 years while working full-time as a secretary, studying by lamplight after Daniel had finished his homework and gone to bed. The degree was in social work, a field I'd been passionate about before marriage, and motherhood had redirected my energies toward more immediate concerns. Beneath the diploma were letters of recommendation from supervisors who'd praised my dedication and insight during my brief career working with families in crisis. I'd been good at that work, really good. I'd understood instinctively how to help people navigate systems that weren't designed with their needs in mind, how to advocate for children and elderly people who couldn't effectively advocate for themselves. I'd stopped working when Daniel's father became ill, choosing to care for my husband at home rather than in a facility where he'd have received competent but impersonal attention. Those 3 years of caregiving had been exhausting but meaningful, filled with moments of genuine connection and the deep satisfaction that comes from providing comfort to someone you love during their most vulnerable time. After his death, I could have returned to social work. Daniel was in college by then, independent and focused on his own future. But grief had made me cautious, and I'd convinced myself that my skills had become outdated, that the field had moved beyond what a woman in her 60s could reasonably master. Instead, I'd settled into the quiet routines of widowhood, defining myself primarily through my relationship with Daniel, and waiting for him to need me in the ways I'd once needed to be needed. I'd made his success my purpose, his happiness my responsibility, his approval my measure of worth. Looking through these old documents now, I saw clearly how I'd diminished myself over the years, how I'd traded competence for convenience and independence for the illusion of indispensability. I'd forgotten that love doesn't require self-erasure, that being a good mother doesn't mean becoming a smaller person. The woman who'd earned that degree while raising a teenager and caring for an ailing husband hadn't been weak or needy. She'd been resourceful, determined, capable of managing multiple demands while maintaining her own sense of purpose and direction. What had happened to her strength? When had I learned to apologize for taking up space in the world? I thought about Margaret, still volunteering at the food bank despite arthritis that made every movement painful. I thought about the other women at the church potluck, each carrying their own stories of loss and adaptation while maintaining dignity and purpose. None of them were waiting for their adult children to validate their existence or approve their choices. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called the local social services office and asked about volunteer opportunities, not because I was lonely or bored, but because I had skills that might be useful and experience that could benefit people facing challenges I understood intimately. The woman who answered the phone was enthusiastic about my background and experience. They desperately needed volunteers to help elderly clients navigate insurance paperwork and benefit applications, she explained. Too many people were falling through cracks because the systems designed to help them were too complicated for anyone to navigate alone. When could you start? She asked, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The pleasure of being wanted for what I could contribute rather than tolerated for what I represented. Next week, I said, surprised by my own decisiveness. I can start next week. As I hung up the phone, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror again. The woman looking back at me appeared different than she had just weeks earlier. Not younger exactly, but more present. Less apologetic, more substantial. That evening, I called Margaret to share my news about the volunteer position. Her enthusiasm was immediate and genuine. Teresa, that's wonderful. You'll be so good at that work. You have exactly the right combination of patience and persistence that those situations require. Her confidence in my abilities felt like sunshine after a long winter. When was the last time someone had expressed faith in my competence rather than concern for my limitations? I'm excited, I admitted, and realized I actually was. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed helping people solve problems. You never lost that ability, Margaret said gently. You just stopped using it for a while. We talked for over an hour, sharing stories about our younger selves and the dreams we'd deferred but not necessarily abandoned. Margaret confessed that she'd been thinking about taking an art class, something she'd always wanted to try, but had convinced herself was impractical for someone her age. Why is it impractical? I asked, genuinely curious. You have time, you have interest, you have hands that work fine for holding brushes. What else do you need? Permission, I suppose, she said with a laugh. Permission to do something just because I want to, without having to justify it as useful or necessary for anyone else. Permission. Such a simple word, but it carried the weight of decades of conditioning that had taught us to seek approval for our desires, to minimize our needs, to justify our choices based on how they served other people rather than how they served our own growth and happiness. After we hung up, I sat in my living room thinking about permission. Who grants it? Who withholds it? And why I'd been waiting for Daniel's approval to live fully in my own life. He hadn't asked for that responsibility, and I'd been unfair to burden him with authority over my happiness and purpose. The truth was both simpler and more complex than I'd been willing to acknowledge. Daniel was building his own life, as he should be at 32. His distance wasn't necessarily a rejection of me personally, but a natural progression toward independence that I'd been interpreting as abandonment because I'd made his approval too central to my own sense of worth. I'd been asking him to carry a weight that wasn't his to bear, the responsibility for my emotional well-being, my social connections, my sense of purpose. No wonder he'd been pulling away. I'd been loving him in ways that felt burdensome rather than supportive, needy rather than nurturing. The volunteer work would give me something meaningful to do with my time and energy, a way to channel the caring instincts that had been focused too intensely on Daniel into broader service that could benefit many people. It would remind me who I was beyond my role as his mother, what I was capable of beyond managing his comfort and approval. But there was something else, something I'd been carrying for years without fully understanding its significance. A secret that would soon become relevant in ways I was only beginning to recognize. Something that would teach Daniel important lessons about independence and interdependence, about taking people for granted and discovering their true value only after it's been withdrawn. The documents in that box contained more than just evidence of my past competence. They contained the key to a future Daniel knew nothing about, a future that would arrive whether he chose to be part of it or not. And for the first time in months, I felt genuinely curious about what that future might hold, what kind of woman I might become when I stopped waiting for permission to be fully myself. My first week of volunteer work at the social services office felt like stepping back into a version of myself I'd almost forgotten existed. The elderly clients who came in clutching confusing insurance forms and benefit notices reminded me of my own mother 20 years ago, overwhelmed by bureaucracy, but too proud to admit they needed help navigating systems designed by people who'd never had to use them. Mrs. Chen, an 84-year-old woman whose Medicare supplement had been mysteriously canceled, sat across from my desk with tears in her eyes as she explained that she couldn't afford her heart medication without proper coverage. Her adult children lived in other states, successful in careers that kept them too busy to help with the complicated paperwork that governed their mother's access to basic health care. They mean well, Mrs. Chen said, echoing words I'd spoken myself so many times. But they don't understand how confusing all this is. They tell me to call the insurance company, but every time I call, I get transferred to someone new who asks me to explain everything all over again. I spent 2 hours on the phone that afternoon, navigating automated systems and speaking with representatives until I found someone who could explain why Mrs. Chen's coverage had lapsed and how to restore it. The solution was simple once you knew which questions to ask and which department actually had authority to fix the problem. But for someone Mrs. Chen's age, dealing with hearing difficulties and the kind of fatigue that comes from living alone with chronic health problems, the process might as well have been designed to discourage rather than assist. When I handed her the confirmation number for her restored coverage, Mrs. Chen gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Thank you," she said. "You don't know what this means to me, but I did know. I understood exactly what it meant to feel invisible, to have your needs treated as inconveniences, to struggle with systems that assumed you had resources and support that you'd actually lost to time and circumstance. The difference was that I had education and experience that allowed me to advocate effectively, while Mrs. Chen had only confusion and fear. That evening, I felt more energized than I had in months. The work was challenging but purposeful, requiring skills I'd developed decades ago but hadn't lost despite years of disuse. Each successful case reminded me that I was capable of making real differences in people's lives, that my experience had value beyond the personal satisfaction it provided. On Thursday of that week, something unexpected happened. I was helping Mr. Rodriguez understand a notice about changes to his Social Security benefits when my phone rang. Not my personal phone, but the office line. "Mrs. Morrison," the receptionist said, "there's a lawyer on line 2 asking about your availability for consulting work." Consulting work. I hadn't heard those words in relation to myself for years. I took the call with curiosity rather than expectation. The voice belonged to Janet Sullivan, a family law attorney whose practice specialized in elder care issues. She'd heard about my background from someone at the social services office and wondered if I might be interested in providing expert consultation on cases involving elderly clients who needed advocates familiar with both social work principles and the practical realities of aging in complex bureaucratic systems. "We see too many cases where families are struggling to help aging parents navigate decisions about care and benefits," she explained. "But most of us don't have the background to understand what these families are really facing, or how to help them access appropriate resources. We need someone who understands the human side of these issues, not just the legal frameworks. The work would be part-time and project-based," she explained, "but the compensation would be substantial. More than I'd ever earned in my previous career. Enough to provide genuine financial security rather than the careful budget management that had characterized my retirement years." "I'd need to think about it," I said, though my heart was already racing with possibilities I hadn't considered since Daniel's father died, and I'd accepted that my productive professional years were behind me. "Of course," Janet said. "Take your time, but I hope you'll consider it seriously. People with your combination of education and experience are rare, and the need for this kind of work is only going to increase as the population ages." After she hung up, I sat in the quiet office surrounded by the files of people whose problems I'd been helping to solve, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: professional excitement. Not just the satisfaction of being useful, but the genuine thrill of being sought after for skills that were valuable in the marketplace. That weekend, I found myself thinking about the consulting offer while I organized my house with new energy. The clutter that had accumulated during my months of depression and isolation suddenly seemed manageable rather than overwhelming. I donated clothes that no longer fit the person I was becoming, cleared surfaces that had been buried under mail and newspapers, opened curtains I'd kept closed during the darkest period of my relationship with Daniel. Saturday evening, as I was going through more papers in my bedroom closet, I came across the envelope that had been waiting there for almost 3 years. The letter I'd received from the law firm handling my late husband's estate, regarding an investment he'd made years before his death, that had been held in trust pending resolution of some regulatory issues. I'd forgotten about it entirely during the grief and adjustment that followed his death, and later I'd filed it away without much thought because the amount seemed too small to matter significantly. But looking at it now, I realized the regulatory issues had been resolved, and the investment had grown substantially during the years it had been held in trust. The amount was enough to change everything. Enough to provide genuine financial independence. Enough to allow me choices I'd never imagined having. Enough to transform me from someone who needed help to someone who could provide it generously to others. I called the law firm Monday morning, and after several transfers and consultations, I found myself speaking with someone who confirmed what the letter had indicated. The funds were indeed available for disbursement, and yes, the amount was correct. More money than I'd ever possessed, more security than I'd dared hope for. "We sent several notices over the years," the attorney explained, "but we understand that families dealing with loss often have more immediate concerns than following up on financial matters that seem complicated or uncertain. Within a week, the funds would be transferred to an account in my name. For the first time in my adult life, I would be truly financially independent, free to make choices based on my preferences rather than my limitations." But Daniel knew nothing about this windfall. He'd never asked about his father's estate beyond the basic assets we'd settled immediately after the funeral. He'd assumed, as I had, that there was nothing significant beyond the house and the small savings account that had covered immediate expenses. This money would change everything about my circumstances, everything about my options, everything about the balance of who needed whom in our relationship. And Daniel had no idea it was coming. As I sat with this knowledge, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and sadness. Excitement for the freedom and possibilities the money represented, sadness for the timing that made it feel like a test of Daniel's character, rather than a simple family blessing. If he'd been kinder during my recovery, more present during my loneliness, more appreciative of the love I'd offered despite his indifference, this money would have been something we celebrated together. I would have shared it gladly, used it to enhance his life as well as mine, treated it as a family asset rather than personal independence. But his behavior over the past months had taught me important lessons about conditional love and fair-weather relationships. The money would arrive just as I was rediscovering my own worth, just as I was building a new life based on my capabilities rather than his approval. The question was, would I tell him? And if so, when? For now, I decided to wait. Let the funds arrive. Let my new consulting career develop. Let Daniel continue living in the world where his mother was a burden rather than a blessing. Soon enough, he would discover that independence was a privilege that could be withdrawn just as easily as it had been granted, and that taking people for granted was a luxury that only lasted as long as those people allowed it to continue. The call came on a Thursday morning in January, just as I was preparing to leave for my third week of consulting work with Janet Sullivan's law firm. The money had arrived in my account 2 weeks earlier, though I'd told no one about it yet. I was still adjusting to the strange sensation of checking my bank balance and seeing numbers that represented genuine security rather than careful calculation. Daniel's voice on the phone carried a tone I hadn't heard in months, not the polite distance or barely concealed irritation that had characterized our recent conversations, but something closer to panic. "Mom, I need to ask you a favor, a big one." I set down my coffee cup and waited, noting how my heart didn't leap with the old eagerness to solve whatever problem had brought him back to my doorstep. Instead, I felt a curious detachment, as if I were observing this conversation from a comfortable distance. "What kind of favor, Daniel?" It's complicated. Can I come over? I don't want to discuss this on the phone." An hour later, he sat across from me in my living room, looking more disheveled than I'd seen him since college finals week. His usually perfect hair was uncombed, his expensive clothes wrinkled, and his hands shook slightly as he reached for the coffee I'd offered out of habit rather than enthusiasm. "Melissa left," he said without preamble. 3 days ago. She took her things and moved back in with her parents." I waited for him to continue, refusing to fill the silence with the sympathetic questions and comforting words that my old self would have offered automatically. This new version of Teresa, the woman who'd been thriving in her consulting work, who'd been sleeping better than she had in years, who'd been remembering what it felt like to be valued for her competence rather than tolerated for her persistence, was curious to hear what would come next. She said I was selfish, that I only think about myself and what I need, and that she couldn't build a future with someone who treated the people who loved him like— He paused, struggling with words that clearly weren't his own, like inconveniences. The irony wasn't lost on me, though I kept my expression neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that, Daniel. That must be very difficult. It gets worse," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The promotion I was expecting? The one I've been working toward for 2 years? They gave it to someone else. Someone younger, they said. Someone who showed more collaborative leadership skills." He laughed bitterly, a sound that held no humor. "Apparently, I have a reputation around the office for being difficult to work with, impatient, dismissive of people who don't think as quickly as I do." I sipped my coffee and watched my son confront, perhaps for the first time, the consequences of treating other people as obstacles rather than human beings worthy of respect and consideration. The pattern that had been evident in our relationship for months, his impatience with anything that required accommodation, his dismissal of needs that interfered with his preferences, had apparently extended to other relationships as well. "But that's not even the worst part," Daniel continued, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that reminded me painfully of the little boy he'd once been when overwhelmed by problems too big for him to solve alone. "The apartment Melissa and I were renting, It was in her name because her credit was better. Now I have 30 days to find somewhere else to live, and everything in the city that I can afford requires first month, last month, and a security deposit that I don't have because I spent all my savings on the engagement ring I was planning to give her next month. An engagement ring. He'd been planning to propose to a woman who'd left him because she couldn't tolerate his selfishness. And now he was facing homelessness because he'd organized his life around someone else's financial stability without maintaining his own independence. "So, I was wondering," he said, finally looking directly at me for the first time since arriving, "if I could stay here for a while, just until I get back on my feet, maybe a month or two." The request hung in the air between us, loaded with irony so heavy it felt like a physical presence in the room. The son who'd been too busy to drive me to medical appointments now needed shelter. The man who'd dismissed my attempts at connection as inconvenient now required my accommodation. The person who'd suggested I figure it out when I needed help was asking me to solve problems he couldn't manage alone. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw not the successful, independent adult he'd been presenting to the world, but a young man who'd confused arrogance with confidence, who'd mistaken dismissiveness for strength, who'd built his identity around being needed by no one, while simultaneously depending on others in ways he'd never acknowledged. "Let me understand this correctly," I said slowly. "You want to move back into the house where you grew up, to be supported by the mother you've been treating like a burden for the past year, while you recover from the consequences of treating other people the way you've been treating me." Daniel's face flushed red. It's not the same thing, isn't it?" I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where I'd been planning to plant flowers this spring. Flowers I could now afford to buy without calculating whether they fit into my grocery budget. "Tell me, Daniel, what makes your need for help different from mine? What makes your problems worthy of accommodation while mine were inconveniences?" "You're my mother," he said, as if this explained everything. "It's different when family helps family." I turned back to face him, and something in my expression made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. "You're absolutely right," I said quietly. "It is different when family helps family. Family doesn't make each other feel ashamed for needing support. Family doesn't treat requests for assistance like impositions. Family doesn't suggest their loved ones figure it out when they're struggling." Daniel's mouth opened as if to argue, but I continued before he could speak. "For the past year, I've been learning to live with the reality that the son I raised to be kind and generous had somehow become someone who viewed my love as a burden rather than a gift. I've been accepting that the young man I sacrificed for and supported through every challenge of his life had decided that reciprocating that support was beneath him. I walked back to my chair but didn't sit down, standing instead with the kind of calm authority I'd forgotten I possessed. "But I've also been learning other things, Daniel. I've been remembering who I was before I made your approval the center of my universe. I've been discovering that I'm capable of much more than being someone's convenient mother when they need something, and invisible when they don't." Daniel looked confused, as if the idea that I might have an identity beyond his occasional needs had never occurred to him. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying that help, real help, is something that flows freely between people who respect each other. It's not something you withhold when it's inconvenient and demand when it's necessary. It's not something you take for granted until you need it yourself." I pulled out my phone and showed him a text I'd received that morning from Janet Sullivan, asking if I could take on additional consulting hours due to increased demand for my services. "I have a career now, Daniel. I have colleagues who value my expertise and clients who appreciate my assistance. I have a life that doesn't revolve around waiting for you to remember that I exist." His eyes widened as he read the message, clearly struggling to reconcile this information with his assumptions about my circumstances. "I also have something else," I continued, walking to my desk and retrieving the bank statement that showed my new account balance. "Something that would have been ours to share if you'd remembered that love is supposed to be mutual." Daniel stared at the numbers, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and finally a kind of dawning understanding that made me almost feel sorry for him. "Where did this come from?" he whispered. "Your father's estate, an investment that took 3 years to mature. Money that could have made both our lives much easier if you'd been the kind of son who deserved to share in family blessings." The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of all the conversations we should have had, all the kindness he should have shown, all the respect I should have demanded much sooner than this moment. Daniel sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, staring at the bank statement as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense with his assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of. When he finally looked up, his eyes held something I hadn't seen in years. Genuine recognition of me as a person rather than a role. "Mom, he began, then stopped, apparently realizing that his usual repertoire of casual dismissals and polite deflections had no application to this moment. I sat down across from him, not with the eager anticipation of someone hoping for reconciliation, but with the patient attention of someone prepared to listen to whatever truth might finally emerge from this conversation. "I didn't know," he said finally, "about the money. About your job, about any of it. You didn't know because you didn't ask," I replied gently. "For months, you've been managing our relationship by assuming I had nothing important happening in my life except waiting for your attention. You never asked about my recovery, my plans, my feelings, or my circumstances because you'd decided they weren't relevant to your life." Daniel's hands trembled as he set the bank statement on the coffee table between us. "I've been a terrible son. You've been a thoughtless son," I corrected. "There's a difference. Terrible implies malicious intent. You weren't trying to hurt me, Daniel. You were just so focused on your own life that you forgot I had one too." He laughed, but it was the sound of someone recognizing an uncomfortable truth rather than finding anything amusing. Melissa said almost exactly the same thing. She said I treated her like she existed to support my goals rather than having legitimate goals of her own. Melissa sounds like a wise woman. She was. I don't know if she'll ever speak to me again. He looked at me with an expression that seemed to age him several years in real time, just like I don't know if you should speak to me again. This was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for during the past months of rebuilding my life and reclaiming my identity. The moment when Daniel would finally understand what he'd lost through his carelessness and ask for the forgiveness that I'd once assumed I would grant automatically. But the woman I'd become through this process of rediscovering my worth wasn't the same woman who'd raised him with unconditional acceptance of whatever attention he chose to offer. This Teresa understood that forgiveness without accountability was enabling rather than loving, that mercy without consequences taught nothing about the value of treating people well. "I think the real question," I said carefully, "is whether you're asking me to help you because you've learned to value our relationship, or because you're in trouble and I'm convenient." Daniel flinched as if I'd slapped him, but he didn't immediately protest or offer easy reassurances. Instead, he sat with the discomfort of honest self-examination for several long minutes. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I want to say it's because I've learned something about how badly I've been treating you, but the timing makes that hard to believe, doesn't it? I show up needing help right after my life falls apart." His honesty surprised me. The old Daniel would have offered confident assurances that his motives were pure, that his recognition of my worth wasn't connected to his current needs. This version seemed capable of acknowledging uncomfortable truths about himself. "Yes, it does make it hard to believe," I agreed. "But it's not impossible to believe. Sometimes people need to lose something before they understand its value. Sometimes we have to experience being dismissed and undervalued before we recognize how it feels to treat others that way." I stood up and walked to the kitchen, returning with the tea service that had sat unused for months, while Daniel preferred quick coffee visits that didn't encourage extended conversation. This time, I set it up deliberately, creating space for the kind of unhurried discussion that meaningful relationships required. "I'm willing to help you," I said, as I poured tea into cups that had been wedding gifts 40 years earlier. "But not the way you're asking." Daniel looked confused. "I don't understand. You want to move back into your childhood bedroom and have me take care of your problems while you figure out your next steps. That's not help. That's enablement. It's me solving your difficulties so you don't have to experience the full consequences of the choices that created them." I handed him a cup of tea and watched him process this distinction. Real help looks different. Real help supports your growth rather than preventing it. Real help treats you like an adult capable of solving problems rather than a child who needs rescue. Over the next hour, I outlined what I was actually prepared to offer. A loan, not a gift. Sufficient to cover first month's rent and security deposit for an apartment within his actual budget, rather than the lifestyle he'd been trying to maintain. References from my professional contacts who might know of job opportunities that valued collaboration over individual brilliance. Emotional support during his process of rebuilding relationships damaged by his previous behavior. But, I continued, all of this comes with conditions. You pay me back according to a schedule we both agree to. You attend counseling to understand why your relationships keep failing due to the same patterns of behavior. And you demonstrate through actions, not words, that you understand family relationships require ongoing investment from both people. Daniel listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. The man sitting across from me seemed genuinely interested in understanding what healthy relationships looked like, rather than simply securing whatever assistance would restore his comfort most quickly. What does ongoing investment mean specifically? He asked. It means you call to ask how I'm doing, not just when you need something. It means you offer help with my projects and challenges, not just accept help with yours. It means you remember that I have a birthday. Holidays matter to me, and my health and happiness are important whether or not they affect your life directly. He was quiet for a long time, staring into his teacup as if it might contain guidance for navigating this unfamiliar territory of reciprocal relationships. I don't know if I know how to do that, he said finally. I think I learned somewhere along the way that needing people was weakness, that independence meant not owing anyone anything, but I also learned that other people's needs were inconveniences, unless they served my purposes. Where did you learn that? I don't know. Maybe from watching Dad work all the time and never seeming to need anything from anyone. Maybe from success in school and work coming so easily that I never had to depend on others. Maybe from you making everything so easy for me that I never had to consider what it cost you. His honesty was painful, but necessary. I'd contributed to his emotional isolation by being so eager to smooth every difficulty that he'd never learned to value the effort love required or to offer that effort to others. Those are explanations, I said gently, but they're not excuses. Lots of people have difficult childhoods or easy successes without becoming adults who treat their families badly. The question is what you want to do with this understanding now. Daniel set down his teacup and looked at me directly for the first time in our conversation. I want to learn how to be better, not just to get out of this mess I've created, but because I don't like who I've become, because I don't want to be the kind of person who loses everyone who matters to them. Then we can work with that, I said. Over the following months, Daniel did move out of the city, not into my house, but into a smaller apartment in a suburb closer to my home where we could see each other regularly without falling into old patterns of dependence and enablement. He found a new job with a nonprofit organization that paid less than his previous position, but valued the collaborative skills he was slowly developing. Most importantly, he began the patient work of learning to see other people as full human beings rather than supporting characters in his own story. It wasn't easy work, and it didn't happen quickly. There were setbacks and misunderstandings, conversations that ended in frustration rather than resolution. But slowly, over time, we built something new between us. Not the relationship we'd had when he was a child and I was his primary caretaker, but something more balanced and more honest. A relationship between two adults who chose to care about each other's well-being rather than taking that care for granted. My consulting work continued to thrive, expanding into training programs for healthcare workers and social service providers. The money from my husband's estate allowed me to be selective about projects, choosing work that felt meaningful rather than simply necessary. Daniel paid back his loan ahead of schedule and began contributing to a fund we established for helping other families navigate the kind of crisis he'd experienced. He rekindled his relationship with Melissa, though they took things slowly, both of them having learned important lessons about the difference between independence and isolation. And me? I learned that love doesn't have to diminish the person who offers it, that being a good mother doesn't require being a smaller person, that helping others can be an expression of strength rather than desperation, and that sometimes the people we love most need to lose our automatic availability before they can appreciate our voluntary presence. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth, but sometimes when silence has done its work of teaching respect, the conversations that follow are richer than anything that came before. The woman who'd once sat alone in an empty kitchen, dismissed by her only son, now shares Sunday dinners with family who understand that love is a choice we make every day rather than an obligation we fulfill when convenient. And that choice, freely given and gratefully received, has made all the difference.